So I think I'm supposed to be starting about this time of that itself, because where we are right now tonight is to go and to debate the proposition that Mark Twain once wrote. And Mark Twain once stated that in the first place, God created idiots, but that was only for practice. Then he created school boards. And we will need to find out, in terms of going and searching the history of Denver public schools, whether, if anything, he was too optimistic and too complimentary about Denver public schools. Basically, what happens on this is by the time of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush of 1858, 1859, there is this increasing feeling that schools and civilization are one and the same. The push for a public school movement had been growing in the United States in the years before the Civil War. And from the beginning, Denver is not so much a gold rush mining camp, but it is a real estate ploy, a suckers area. And Denver is founded on the principle of what is called the bigger fool theory of real estate. And the bigger fool theory of real estate basically states, I might be a total fool to pay $100 for a lot in the such and such a place, but there is a bigger fool that is out there that is going to pay $200 for it along the way out of it. But the way you have to keep going and bringing in bigger fools is by going and constantly having some sort of promotion, some sort of attraction that is going to go and bring people into the community. And early on, Denver is much, much more a family town than it is a mining town. About a fourth of all of the people living in early Denver are families, including children, and that requires a school. And almost from the time of the very first settlement here in November 1858, there is this push underway that what is necessary is to have a school to assure that Denver will be a good family community. And there are various efforts to try to found a school, but nothing is of all that much success until Owen Goldrick arrives on the scene. Owen Goldrick is among the semi-legendary characters of early Denver. He claims to have been born in County Sligo at about 1829, or maybe 1833, or maybe 1834 of this, from a family of school teachers, and he comes as a scholar as a youth. He goes to Trinity College in Dublin. He gets a master's from Columbia University. Or maybe what happens is his family is among those that is suffering from the upheavals in Ireland in the 1840s. His older brothers come to Denver in the 1840s of this. Meanwhile, his father, instead of being a good Catholic, rather lands up becoming a total skeptic that gets excommunicated. And anyway, the Goldrick family comes to the United States, and soon they are school teachers. And before long, Owen Goldrick is supposedly a scholar of the classics, of Latin, of Greek, of mathematics, of orthography, of geography. You name the area of expertise, and Owen Goldrick is the expert on that until he lands up becoming a book salesman in Cincinnati. And this is the situation in 1857 when the economy in the entire Midwest lands up collapsing. He goes to St. Louis, and in St. Louis he teams up with a guy named Joseph Doyle. Joseph Doyle is among the major shippers from the Midwest to the Rocky Mountain region, and especially to Santa Fe, to New Mexico of this. And Doyle has a ranch close to Santa Fe, where not only are his children growing up, but the employees on his ranch and his trading empire need a schoolmaster. So Goldrick comes to Hermosillo, New Mexico as a schoolmaster, and he totally hates it. And amidst all of this, he sees that Doyle is starting to ship goods to nascent Denver in 1859, so he joins a Doyle wagon train that lands up showing up in Denver in June 1859. And according to the lore, the wagon train is coming into Denver. And whenever a wagon train comes into Denver, it's a big attraction because not much organized entertainment is going on, and the locals are always curious to see who's going to show up. And Goldrick understands this, and towards this end, he lands up going and telling others in the wagon train, I'm going to be an hour late coming into town. So he lets the rest of the wagon train come in, and then an hour later, here he is whipping his oxen. Yea, Prometheus! Woe, Ephemesius! Vino, vino, vici! Out of this, sic semper tyrannus! And all sorts of pig Latin out of this here. Let me introduce myself. I am Professor Owen J. Goldrick. I am the professor. I have come to Denver to provide enlightenment to the community of this. And on this basis, with subscriptions, he lands up founding Denver's first school in October 1859. And it's a hit or miss affair out of this, and Goldrick actually has amazingly diverse views on education, which is you don't necessarily whip your students out of this itself, and you don't load them down with homework either on that. And you rather let them learn by themselves. And in particular, the way they learn by themselves out of this is there is a bar right across the street from Goldrick's school, which is over at about 11th and Larimer Streets in what is today the Auraria campus, and he gets sick of his students and he appoints an older student as a caretaker, and amidst all of this, he goes over to the bar for a game of cards and a drink or two out of it there. So he has quite a relaxed schoolhouse manner along the way there. But there is soon this demand for schoolmasters and schoolmistresses, especially when Owen Goldrick finds out that you can do a lot better and you can be a far better fabricator by going and writing for newspapers than standing in front of a bunch of unappreciative students in one manner or another out of this itself. So he soon is a journalist. He soon has his own weekly newspaper, the Rocky Mountain Herald, and meanwhile, a variety of different schoolmistresses, schoolmasters come into town. Meanwhile, the political situation here is chaotic. For a while, there is something called the Jefferson Territory overseeing Denver, and Jefferson Territory is a good example of practical anarchy. Those that want to obey the government, obey the government. Those that don't like the government claim the Jefferson Territory is totally illegal, and they ignore the government. It's not until 1861 that the Territory of Colorado is established, and among the first things that the Territory of Colorado lands up doing is going and ordering the creation of public school systems. And on this basis, about a year later, December 1862, Denver has its first public schools. And over the course of the next decade, they stagnate as Denver stagnates. And typical of the way Denver is stagnating at this time is in 1860, during the first census on the creation of Denver. The population of Denver is 4,749 people. By 1870, the population is 4,759 people. In other words, they have gained 10 people in 10 years. Out of that, they are of that, but then in the 1870s, the population explodes to 36,000 people. By 1890, it's 106,000 people. And by this time, Denver is a very starkly divided geographic city. And part of the 1861-1862 creation of public schools in Denver creates a District Number 1, and that's all the land off to the northeast of Cherry Creek, today's downtown, as East Denver. The land the other side of Cherry Creek, where Auraria is District Number 2. West Denver of that. A District Number 3 for North Denver never takes off. There's a District Number 4 for Englewood, Littleton area. There's a District Number 5 that goes over near Henderson Islands, parts of modern Adams County itself. And there's always this feeling that you can do good for yourself if you do well for the schools. And this is typical of Amos Steck. Amos Steck is an early promoter, attorney, who is the founding president of the school board of District Number 1. And he soon sees that District Number 1 needs a real schoolhouse. And towards this end, he donates land for a real East Denver schoolhouse over at the corner of 18th and Arapahoe Streets. And the reason he's giving the free land away is because if you build the new school there, the surrounding property that he also owns is all going to escalate in value. But anyway, this leads to the creation of the first real schoolhouse of Denver, something called Arapahoe School, which was located over at where Skyline Park is today, at about the west corner of 18th and Arapahoe Street. And in no time, it's a very impressive building that is completely packed with 600, 700 students in there. There's soon a wide variety of other East Side schoolhouses. And from the beginning, Denver wants schoolhouses to be temples of education. Schoolhouses are not to be drab, boring, dull buildings led by drab, dull, boring teachers, but they are going to be beautiful statements, literal landmarks that will stand out, that will catch the eye of the public to show the inspirational role of education of that itself. And before long, just having the primary school of grades 1 through 8 is not enough on this there, where about 1873, there's the first efforts to have high school classes in town. That actually leads to the first Denver high school graduation in 1877, but by that time, it's passé. The Catholics were in the lead of the high school movement out here. Something that is still going today, St. Mary's Academy, which is the elite Catholic girls' school of town, has the first graduating class of high school, one diploma in 1875. Boulder High School has its first graduating class in 1876. So East High is not always first along the way. It just pretends to be on that. And typical of what ends up going on and happening with East High School is soon it just doesn't work of having high school students sharing the same building with young elementary students, and East needs to have a building of its own. And on this basis, in 1881, it occupies among the largest, most impressive high school buildings in the country, over on the block surrounded by 19th, 20th Stout, and California streets, where the new old customs house of Denver is, or maybe it's the old new customs house of town. There's debates on the name of the place there, and in the course of going and building the new East Side High School, they decide they are going to have the loveliest young girl in Denver smiling at the students. So there is a beauty pageant of all the 5- and 6-year-old girls of town. And soon the school district decides that the 6-year-old Ella Maddie is the most beautiful, angelic girl of Denver. They hire the head of the art department out at DU of this, Preston Powers, of this, to go and cast a bust of her, and they put the bust of her in the Keystone Arch above the main entry of East High School. And students going to a school with such an angelic girl greeting them along the way must be the angels. And that's how students at East High School became the angels out of this. Or was it false advertising? Are they really the Beast High School students in terms of compared to, you have West High School, which is started about 1881. They're simply cowboys. North High School, that's about 1885. They're the Vikings. And for some years, the girls at North High School were the Vikings to match the Vikings out of that. Their South High School is the veritable latecomer around the area. In fact, South High School only has its first 12-year graduating class in 1908, and they are the rebels at South High School. But if you are a South High student and try to be a rebel, you are in for severe problems, because basically South High School is the typical regimented hierarchical building where among the ways you deal with students is very, very simple. You beat them and beat them and beat them. And for years, Denver had debates over how much you should beat students out of that itself. And eventually, for junior high and high school students, they had what was known as the paddle. And the paddle was this device about the size of a baseball bat, of this with a big paddle at the end of it, and the assistant principal was the official designed to impose the paddling. And a big debate that would go on among school administrators for many years was whether you should drill holes in the paddle or not, because would that deliver more painful blows along the way out of that there. In fact, it's not until the 1980s that they quit paddling boys, officially at least, in Denver public schools. This, but the guy that sort of is putting together Denver public schools at this period is Aaron Gove. And he's another of these strange characters that just is constantly floating around Denver public schools. Originally, he's from New Hampshire, grows up in Boston. Suddenly, his family locates on the farming frontier of Illinois, where he goes to work at something like age 15 as a rural school teacher. And before long, he realizes that's not enough, and that the way you have to become a real school teacher is by being somebody that is very, very normal. And the joke of being normal and being a school teacher is he is among the key people that is enrolling in among the very first normal schools in the United States. Back during the French Revolution, there is a big push for having professionally trained teachers. And as part of the French Revolution, something called the Institut Normal Supérieur lands up emerging to specially train school teachers with a normal routine. So being a normal routine, and you soon have across the country various normal schools emerging. For example, in Colorado, where the University of Northern Colorado is, that was originally Colorado Normal School. And for the most part, normal schools had about half of the curriculum, half of the requirement that four-year colleges did. And basically, you simply had to go through a two-year program to become normal and be certified as a teacher into the 20th century. And for years there were always debates and discussions and academic snobbery. Are some graduate of a four-year college better than a normal college of this? But really it wasn't until the 1920s that they actually landed up having the requirement that you have a college degree before you had to be a teacher along the way. Well, anyway, Aaron Gove goes away as a dashing hero in the Civil War. Amidst this, he comes back to Normal, Illinois as his abode. Normal, Illinois is the state location of the Illinois Normal College, which is actually not that far from Bloomington, and it's the founding institution of Illinois State University, and soon he is superintendent of schools of Normal in Illinois, and he understands the idea of publicity. And towards this end, he soon is issuing his own newspaper, the Illinois Schoolmaster, that has an amazing national circulation. And out of the blue, it seems, he is recruited to come to Denver in 1874 as the first true superintendent of Denver Public Schools. And among the people with whom he lands up dealing with is a mercantile grocer, Chester Morey, along the way. And Chester Morey is always going and announcing that he is very, very dedicated to education, and he's a neighbor of Aaron Gove. And meanwhile, Chester Morey has another bosom buddy, William Henry Smiley. And William Henry Smiley is an orphan in a suburb of Boston. And he just seems to have this outstanding academic skills. He is given a full scholarship to Harvard itself, and after teaching in an elite Episcopal school in Boston for a couple, 3 years, he is recruited to something called Jarvis Hall, which was this effort to have this super deluxe, super elite Episcopal boys' school in Denver. And he could always talk to you in Latin or Greek and seemed to be this nice, genial schoolmaster. And when suddenly there is a vacancy as the Latin instructors at East High School about 1886, Smiley becomes an East High Latin classics teacher, and at this time, East is projecting itself as a preparatory school. And what you are preparing for is college. And colleges demand that you be fluent in Latin and that you know ancient history. And knowing Greek helps along the way out of this. Anything practical or useful is completely beyond the realm of the East High curriculum. And on this basis, William Henry Smiley becomes principal of East High School about 1890. And apparently he's this jovial old figure that tends to work well with the business establishment, with most of the high-class students in town of this. And after Aaron Gove retires as superintendent in 1904, Aaron Gove decides he wants to have a sweet tooth. And towards this end, he becomes president of Great Western Sugar and soon is a big sugar lobbyist. And before long, William Henry Smiley is superintendent of schools, and he does such a good job as superintendent of schools, he gets fired as superintendent of schools in 1915, and this leads to a virtual coup d'etat in Denver, where there are soon two factions. There are the pro-Smiley people and the anti-Smiley people, and in 1917, the pro-Smiley people pack the school board, recall the anti-Smiley members, and they rehabilitate William Henry Smiley as a good old boy, as assistant superintendent, and subsequent superintendents realize that William Henry Smiley doesn't know what he's doing, but he's a nice, jovial character to have at the central administration, till they finally retire him about 1928 when they build a new junior high school up at 25th and Holly Street, Smiley Junior High School, and part of the purpose of having the new Smiley Junior High School is to relieve the overload from Gove Junior High School over at 14th Avenue and Colorado Boulevard. And actually the presence of Gove Junior High School says a lot also about the city. And what happens on this is as the section of eastern Capitol Hill towards Colorado Boulevard and east of Colorado Boulevard is rapidly growing in the early 20th century, they see they need a school for the area, so they open Aaron Gove School about 1910 of this. And meanwhile, they're having yet another problem in the school system, which is that basically 7th and 8th graders are becoming adolescents. They're becoming unruly. They're becoming rowdy out of this, and they just don't fit in the school with kindergartners, first, second graders, and meanwhile, 9th graders are totally lost as freshmen in high school. So the big reform around the time of World War I is let's go and move 6th and 7th and 8th graders into new junior high schools and take the 9th graders and also add them to junior high schools out of that as a great reform. And actually the very first building to have junior high classes in Denver is Gove in 1917. Then they soon decide we need to have a real Capitol Hill junior high school, so that becomes Chester Maury Junior High School that opens about 1921 out of this, and that's actually sort of yet another tradition that is going on in terms of Denver public schools, because for the most part, Denver Public Schools has never named its buildings after literary figures, after scholars, that itself. There's a few people, like there used to be a Louisa May Alcott School over at West 41st Avenue and Tennyson Street, where all the students were supposed to be appropriate little men and little women along the way. Bryant Webster still exists. That was partly a merger of a William Cullen Bryant School that was over at West 46th Avenue and Shoshone Street. Out of that, it merged with either Noah Webster School or Daniel Webster School. Nobody's ever figured out who the Webster of Bryant Webster is. There is an Emerson School, which is actually the oldest existing schoolhouse of Denver, which is located over at 14th Avenue and Ogden Street, but they closed the program at Emerson School in 1979. At one time, there used to be Longfellow School, and Longfellow School was located at 13th Street and Welton Street, which later becomes Opportunity School. And then there's Whittier School over at 25th and Downing Street, and typical of how few people remember John Greeley Leaf Whittier is what I sometimes give tours over there. They ask me, why is the neighborhood called Whittier and why is the school named Whittier? It's because they had such brilliant students when the first Whittier building is going up in the 1880s. And they were so much smarter, so much more witty than anybody else, they figured the school for all those witty students ought to be Whittier along the way. And people believe me along that. But anyway, that's just sort of typical of what had been going on with this. Well, meanwhile, Denver is at war with the rest of Colorado by the beginning of the 20th century. And amidst all of that, there is sort of this idea of quarantine Denver. And the way they decided they were going to quarantine Denver is that in 1902, Colorado voters adopt something called the Rush Act, a new Article 20 of the Colorado Constitution. And that creates an independent city and county of Denver, separate from the old Arapahoe County, of which Denver was county seat. They create a new Arapahoe County, they create a new Adams County, but more than that, the creation of the city and county of Denver also specifies that there would be a merger, consolidation of the different school districts around town. And by this time, you not only have District 2 for the west side, District 17 is for the north side, where North Side High School is. District 7 is for the south side, where South High School is. There was once a District 21 where Eagleton School is over about West 9th Avenue and Hazel Court. It had its own high school at one time or another, and there were a number of other scattered little schools out of there, but now the consolidated District Number 1 of Denver is going to unite east, west, north, and south, and oh yes, there's Manual along the way. And the origins of Manual High School is yet another reflection of the changing character of the school system out of this, because if you go to East High School and you get prepared for really what? Suddenly you have your diploma, and really what good is knowing Latin and ancient history going to do for you? So among the things that Chester Morey does, who's on and off the school board, is saying that what Denver needs is vocational education, and that there needs to be a school that is going to give students manual training so they, when they get their degree, they actually know something. They can be a carpenter or a plumber or electrician or a mason out of that. So about 1893, 1894, Manual opens as Denver's first magnet school. And basically, if you want to have the traditional elite education, you go to East High School. If you want to learn something practical, you go to Manual. And Manual actually also has an outstanding science program, an art and architecture program out of that. So again, it was sort of this idea that the district needs to offer different classes, different varieties to everybody along the way. And on this basis, Denver Public Schools seems to be going someplace on that. And this is the situation after World War I. And after World War I, Denver is a very, very troubled city. It fought the war to end all wars. And there's still wars. It abolished prostitution. And there's still women of the street out there. It has abolished alcohol, and there's still alcoholism and drinking of this. And there needs to be a group that is out there that is acting to make sure that Denver becomes a good 100% pure, all-American Christian community. And the group that comes to the fore asserting Denver as a 100% pure, all-American Christian community is the Ku Klux Klan. And amidst all of this, for a couple of years, the Ku Klux Klan is surging. At the peak of its influence, it has upwards of 55,000 members in a Denver of 250,000 population, plus a large women's clan, plus a group called the Royal Riders of the Red Robe, which lands up going and being naturalized immigrants supporting the Klan. It elects a Klansman, Ben Stapleton, mayor. It elects a Klansman, Clarence Morley, governor. It elects a Klansman, Rice Means, to the United States Senate, but it never is quite able to sink its claws into Denver public schools, which tends to be dominated by the traditional, business-oriented Republicans that have no use for the ideological frenzy of the Klan. Of course, that's not quite true, because you used to have integrated schools in Denver. In fact, Denver schools are integrated since at least the opening of Arapahoe School in 1873. But can we have black girls swimming with white girls at Maury Junior High School in the first high school junior high pool of Denver? Can we have black girls socializing with white girls over at Manual? And the great superintendent of Denver of the 1920s, Jesse Newland, says, of course we can't of this. And Denver imposes Jim Crow practices, and there's a nasty civil rights fight on that. And this is sort of typical of Jesse Newland. And Jesse Newland is another of these characters that sort of personifies Denver public schools. He's this very aggressive, gung-ho figure that is out there that comes to Denver in 1920 as superintendent of schools, and he is part of the Columbia Circle, or the Columbia Ring. And at this time, Columbia Teachers College is the foremost institute of teaching the teachers in the United States out of this, especially those that want to be administrators. And before long, having a master's or a doctorate from Columbia University Teachers College has twice the prestige of a graduate degree from lesser schools like Harvard. Maybe University of Chicago comes close out of this. And over the next 50 years, Columbia Teachers College just systematically tries to control the National Education Association, tries to place its alumni in leading school districts around the area, and Jesse Newland is typical of that. And on paper, he sounds like a great guy as an educator. We need democracy in the classrooms. We need flexible curriculum there. There's no fixed, hard answers. Different students learn at different paces out of this. And we need to treat teachers as professionals with a uniform salary schedule out of it, and he does so well on this. He's a great publicist. He gets Denver Public Schools top publicity. He lands up going to become a leader of Teachers College in Columbia in 1927. Until his death about 1940, he just is constantly manipulating Denver Public Schools and a large variety of other school systems across the country out of Columbia University. In fact, alumni that with graduate degrees of Columbia Teachers College are still major figures in Denver Public Schools into the 1980s of this. And actually, the one person I've met in the hierarchy of Denver Public Schools today, Susanna Cordova, she knew exactly what I was talking about when I was asking her about what do you know about the Columbia Teachers College conspiracy, that for the most part, most rank and file teachers, board members have never realized the nefarious role of Columbia University. Well, meanwhile, another thing that Jesse Newland is doing in the 1920s is going and pushing a total rebuilding of Denver Public Schools. Because by this time, Denver is an old city. It's 75 years old, and it seemingly is stagnating of this with 19th century school buildings. So what the result is what we need is to go and have modern school buildings for a modern city. But more than that, at the 1920s, there's this booster idea that Denver needs to double its population from 250,000 population to 500,000 population by 1930. So if you build a new schools for a city of 500,000 people, they're all going to come. And the masterpieces of the 1920s is a new East High School, a new South High School, a new West High School, various junior highs, numerous elementary schools. And again, this was also supposed to be a sign of architectural distinction. And no sooner is the last of the buildings of the 1920s building program completed, Horace Mann Junior High School in 1931, which has stunning brickwork on it, then the system goes broke. And they have time servers in office in terms of it itself. And basically the district tends to stagnate until 1947, when its longtime old fogey superintendent Charles Green steps down, claiming being superintendent is a man killer, and he figures he needs a nothing job instead of being superintendent, a professor of education out at DU. To replace him, Kenneth K. Oberholzer comes on the scene. And Kenneth K. Oberholzer is not only another product of Columbia Teachers College. His father was superintendent of schools of Tulsa, superintendent of schools in Houston, the founder of the University of Houston. And Kenneth K. Oberholzer gets his high school diploma from Tulsa. After getting his bachelor's from the University of Illinois, he starts teaching in small villages in Texas and keeps moving into becoming a superintendent. And along the way, he becomes Jim Crow. He is living in Jim Crow, and he just accepts that Jim Crow is automatically the way you land up running a school system that lands up haunting Denver after he becomes superintendent in 1947. But Oberholzer, again, has a great publicist on this. He lands up going and being on the cover of Time magazine whenever there is a national forum about what is going on in our schools. Usually Kenneth K. Oberholzer has a say in terms of this. He's wildly popular with the press, and he sees that Denver's population is booming after World War II. Denver goes from a population of about 350,000 in 1940 to nearly 500,000 by 1960. And during the 1950s, Denver is engaged in massive new building programs. A lot of the schools, as soon as they open, they're automatically double sessions of this. And in 1955, voters go and decide what Denver really needs are 3 new high schools to bring Denver into the 1960s. And towards this end, they're going to build a school for Southwest Denver over at South Federal Boulevard and West Evans Avenue. That becomes Abraham Lincoln. And they are going to build a school on the very far southeastern fringes of Denver at Happy Canyon Drive and about Holly Street, and that becomes Thomas Jefferson. And it's right on the boundary because the idea is having the high school right next to unincorporated Arapahoe County is going to go and lead the people in Arapahoe County to want to join the marvelous Denver public school system. The third proposed high school was going to be at 6th Avenue and Monaco Street Parkway. And when the Denver Public Schools announces that it's going to build this new high school at 6th Avenue and Monaco Street Parkway, Palmer Hoyt objects. Palmer Hoyt at this time is the publisher-editor of the Denver Post. And while he generally supports Denver Public Schools, is a friend of Kenneth Oberholzer, he lives over at 400 Monaco Street Parkway, and he makes it known he does not want a high school going up next to his house. And he basically lets Kenneth Oberholzer know that if you try to build a high school next to my house, the Denver Post is going to turn on you and do everything possible to defeat the bond issue for the new high school building program. So on this basis, they decide to go and build the new George Washington High School a mile farther to the south out of that, over about Virginia Avenue. Are you patriots well aware of how they built your school over there for the occasion? Of course they told you that, didn't they, during orientation? I didn't think they would. They never told us what an angel was at East High School. For that matter, that itself. Another thing that Kenneth Oberholzer is very much into is educational television. And there is this extreme lack of classroom space, a shortage of instructors in the 1950s, and the solution is Denver Public Schools manages to get its own television frequency, Channel 6, that goes on the air in 1956. And Channel 6 was KRMA, which, as you all know, stands for Knowledge for the Rocky Mountain Area. They don't even know what KRMA is, the call letters of Colorado Public Television these days. Was I pious enough in saying that? There, that itself, and the idea was you didn't get live classroom instruction. Now that you had Channel 6 on the air, there'd be a television in your classroom. The teacher would turn on the television, and her role was to make sure you all behaved while you listened to the instructor on television. You couldn't ask questions, you couldn't interact, whatever. That was the idea of educational television during the day of that itself. And meanwhile, there starts being racial tensions coming and going within the school district itself, and Kenneth Oberholzer keeps drawing boundaries, so certain schools will be for blacks, certain schools will be for whites. And typical of what happens on this here is Park Hill School was supposed to be the elite school of the elite neighborhood, of the elite people that could just be comfortably smug and complacent about themselves, the Park Hill ethic of this, with Park Hill School being a very, very beautiful building up at 19th Avenue and Elm Street. And it's being packed in the 1950s, and meanwhile, middle-class African Americans are moving just to the north of City Park towards Colorado Boulevard, and Denver Public Schools doesn't have a building for them, so it starts busing black students to Park Hill Schools. And is this appropriate? Having to have the black students get up early, take the bus, go to school and wait. After school, they have to spend another 15, 20 minutes, a half hour before the buses arrive to take them back. And Oberholzer's solution to all of this is to build a new Harry Barrett Elementary School at 29th Avenue and Jackson Street. When that opens in 1960, suddenly Park Hill School is all white again, Barrett School is all black again, and the black middle class just explodes. It's convinced that black schools do not get as good as education as white schools, but that doesn't dissuade Oberholzer, because by this time, Gove Junior High School is just considered ancient, obsolete, no good, in need of replacement. Already in 1952, he promises a new Gove Junior High School. Nothing happens. 1962, he promises a new Gove Junior High School, and it was going to be at 32nd Avenue, Martin Luther King Drive, and Colorado Boulevard. and Black Denver again explodes. It's located in such a place, it's going to be all black, so Smiley can remain an all-white school in elite, distinguished Park Hill. And basically, the civil rights movement lands up going and protesting all of this. Well, anyway, the upshot of all this is finally in 1966, Kenneth Oberholzer is on the verge of turning 65. His contract is up in 1967. He hears that Sheila is going to enroll in Denver Public Schools amidst all of that. So he retires in 1967 and moves out to California. And the original response is, we need to memorialize Kenneth K. Oberholzer. And the best way to go and memorialize Kenneth K. Oberholzer was by going and renaming Channel 6 from KRMA to KKKO television for Kenneth K. Oberholzer. Out of that never quite makes it off the ground. And meanwhile, by this time, tensions over the racial integration of schools, whether black schools are second-rate to white schools, is just on the verge of exploding there. And the explosion comes in 1969. So I decided to go and end the book with the end of Kenneth K. Oberholzer of this. Anyway, over the years, I've talked a lot about schools on my tours of Denver, on my books about Denver, especially my neighborhood tours. They're around schools because they are such vital, defining institutions of the community in regard to that. And in most of my neighborhood, the books, I talk a lot about them. For example, in my book about this section of town, which is the Spirits of South Broadway, there's everything from Sherman Street to school, which is of course on Grant Street, a couple blocks from here. There's the old Byers Elementary School that lands up becoming Alameda School over at West Byers Place in Bannock. There's a place called Fairmont at West 3rd Avenue and Alati Street. There's Baker Junior High School. All of that would be in books like this itself on that, and I've been told I ought to incorporate all of these together, plus what all the nitty-gritty is in terms of the school system. And on this basis, I make connections with a couple of former members of the school board and a bunch of busybodies. And over the years, if you are a busybody, you always have an opportunity in Denver Public Schools. They have had countless advisory committee, volunteer committees, coordinating committees, and I ran into somebody. She was real active when her children were in school in the 1980s, 1990s, and this is the situation about 2000 when Denver Public Schools doesn't care about its records anymore. And it basically is ready to dispose of its records. It gave a lot of them to Denver Public Library. Others are damaged by a flood of this, and she makes off with an immense amount of Denver Public School records, PTA records that nobody else wanted. And she started saying, here, you want to see some of the things I have? And I got addicted to all of the interesting insider reports that she was providing me with on that. So it was about, I'd say, the summer of 2017, which is when I get going on this project. I had just completed my book that I don't even see on the shelves right here of this, about modern East Denver, the Mayfair area, that I start work on that. And as I feared with the project, it starts growing and growing and growing. And the more I look, the more I find along the way. And it was soon sort of obvious that there was more than one volume here, which I really didn't want, because multi-volume series do not sell that well on this. But at the same time, I figured if I'm going to do it, I need to do it right. I need to be comprehensive. So that's basically what the Denver School Book is all about on this. And incidentally, if you want a free copy of the cover, you're welcome to have one. And there's sort of a very strange joke on the cover of the book, if you'd like this. In the forefront of the tower of East High School, there is something called the Sullivan Gateway. And the Sullivan Gateway is this commanding, columned fountain area as sort of the approach to East High School. And right atop the column is a man and a woman that she has her arm around him, sort of the intrepid farm couple. And somehow she lost her head over this book. I don't know what happened with this, because right after, about the time the book comes into print, suddenly they have to rush my cover artist to the hospital with a severe emergency operation, and I haven't wanted to bother her with that. Right about the same time, the guy that did a lot of illustrations for me in the book has to flee to Mexico for a special cancer treatment down there that he can't get here. So maybe this is the curse of Denver Public Schools still going along the way of that. So with that said, are there questions, comments, ideas, or should I go on with another half hour of all the other screwy stories of Denver Public Schools I have not even begun to address? Oh. You want me to keep going? Gee whiz, on that here of all the dirty backbiting, because another thing that goes on is for many, many years, the Chamber of Commerce runs Denver Public Schools. And in 1917, the Chamber of Commerce, other big money interests, finance packing the school board and going and recalling members that are a little questionable, little challenge to business. And from then until the 1950s, usually working with the PTA, there is a biennial caucus sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce where it comes up with its candidates for the school board. And there's about 5 people during that entire 30-year period that are not Chamber of Commerce people that make their way onto the school board, including 2 supporters of the Ku Klux Klan in 1925. Out of that, so you always had sort of these dullards in a certain way on the school board that are there because it's good for business. Whether it's good for learning, forget it along the way out of that. And again, is the role of the schools to encourage students to think for themselves? Or is it to learn how to take tests along the way out of it? And for years, DPS had this extreme testing routine. And generally, it tended to do fairly well on standardized tests, especially in the better schools in town of that itself. And I was so frustrated with all of this, of being a very unhappy product of East High School. By the time I'm set to graduate in 1970, that when they call all the seniors in for a special week of testing, right before graduation, I try to put together the Great East High School Flunkin'. And the idea of the Great East High School Flunkin' is to answer all of the questions wrong on the standardized examinations. I don't think that any of the other people that were in on this followed through on it. But when finally I get the results, my counselor, who I was at war with for 3 years, and every time she suggested things, that meant just things were getting even worse. Thanks to her suggestions, calls me in and says, "Are you proud you have the IQ of an idiotic imbecile?" In terms of that, where I had absolute zeros on all of my test scores out of it. So that was my contribution to Denver Public Schools along the way there. So anyway, what's going on is we need to get out of here for a while because they have a concert coming up here at about 9 o'clock, 9:30. If you want to know the full history of this building, Mutiny, which was once a drugstore, among other things, Republic Drugs, that becomes a lot of different things, that becomes a bookstore about 1989 with different incarnations. There's a great DVD out about this part of South Broadway that you can go and get for only $5 directly from me tonight on that, shot by Jason, who's our cameraman over there, who gets the money out of that itself. I have a variety of my other titles up on the table of that itself. One book that I have that the store does not have, you do have to get directly from me, is my out-of-print Denver Streets, Names, Numbers, Locations, Logic, the complete book to getting you completely lost in town. It's not going to help you find your way around town, but once you're lost, it'll tell you exactly why you're lost, how you came to be lost, the history of the street on which you are lost, and who named the streets on which you are lost. This actually can't get it anybody from me, and I'm charging a ridiculous price of $30 for it tonight. I also have a list of my forthcoming tours, talks up here you're welcome to have on that. So unless you have any other good school stories or outrageous tales of that, you'll just have to wait till next year. And Volume 2 is going to deal with the Denver school busing wars, the riots, court impositions, out of that, how they keep firing superintendents, out of that, how Mark Twain proves to be an optimist in evaluating the character of the Denver school board over the years. Volume 3 is going to basically be from the end of busing, or maybe the early 1990s, into the contemporary era out of that. And that's the one I really am going to be dangerous of, where I just will have to say what I really think about some of these people. So anyway, thanks a lot for showing up. I'll be glad to sign books for you up here. But that you have to buy the book from the bookstore.